Japan entered the 20th century in a period of transition. A country which had isolated itself from the outside world was being reborn as a leading world power. It was opening to the world and hastened to catch up with its backlog in all the most important spheres of industry, such as shipbuilding, aviation, and engineering. Foreign specialists were invited to train Japanese engineers, and the Japanese themselves started traveling and studying technical novelties. Over several decades, Japan managed to catch up with its backlog in the technical aspect almost from scratch, and to realize itself as a power which should dominate implicitly in the region. As it started to gain power, Japan turned its attention to its neighbors, aiming at expanding its areas of influence and its territories. Thus, in 1879, the Ryukyu state located on Okinawa Island was annexed, and in 1894, Japan fought a war with China, as a result of which Japan gained the island of Taiwan. Another war over redivision of areas of influence was fought between Japan and Russia in 1904 and 1905, the main result of which was the final annexation of Korea to Japan in 1910. All those wars won at the turn of the century built up the glory of the Japanese Army and Navy, as well as strengthening the faith of the Japanese in their unconquerable armed forces, and their confidence that Japan should become the largest state in Asia. In 1922, Japan was the first country in the world to launch a ship whose class was strictly determined as aircraft carrier. Shortly after that, aircraft carriers initially built as battleships went into service. All these facts demonstrate the importance of specifically naval aircraft in Japan. As both the Army and Navy possessed their own aircraft in Japan, both of them developed its aircraft quite separately. In fact, these two military forces were completely independent of each other and sometimes had utterly different views on conducting military operations and the location of those actions as well. In 1937, a new war with China began when Japan established control over the northern and central parts of the territory. In response to the war in China and the movement of troops into French Indochina, the USA placed an embargo on oil and metal supply to Japan. These materials were vital for the conduct of military operations, so Japan had to seek out another source. It was quickly found in European colonies in Southeast Asia, which automatically made them the object of military invasion. After the introduction of the embargo, the Japanese headquarters became more and more conscious that conflict with the USA and England was inevitable if the country continued its expansion southwards. And consequently, plans for a preemptive strike began to emerge. One of the possible plans even provided for striking an aircraft carrier blow on the Pearl Harbor naval base located on the Oahu island of Hawaii. However, these plans would only be implemented if peace talks failed and Japan did not succeed in convincing America in the rightness of her position. On April 10, 1941, Japan established the first aircraft carrier fleet comprising 3 divisions of 2 aircraft carriers each. It was the first large formation of aircraft carriers in the world. And on November 16, 1941, 1 century after American military forces put an end to the isolation of Japan, the Japanese First Air Fleet, including 6 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Zuikaku, left their ports and headed to Hawaii. Japanese forces estimated results of the attack on Pearl Harbor to be phenomenal. They achieved complete surprise, and according to pilots' reports, several ships and a large number of aircraft were destroyed. American forces in the Pacific suffered shattering losses. Several battleships, the pride of both sides' navies, were destroyed. Japan implemented an unprecedentedly bold plan. 6 aircraft carriers came almost close to the naval base of the enemy, attacked it suddenly, and achieved complete success in their attack. It was the real triumph for the Japanese Navy. Besides success in Pearl Harbor, the Japanese forces managed to occupy a small island of Wake, which was located in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and had a runway defended by a small marine garrison. Though not without losses among warships, the island's defense was overwhelmed and the landing troops freely landed on its territory. In January 1942, Japan landed its forces in Burma, the Dutch East Indies, New Guinea, and Solomon Islands. On February the 15th, it surrounded 130,000 soldiers during the Battle of Singapore. And in May, the rest of American and English forces yielded themselves in the Philippines. Occupation of all these territories was stipulated by the general plan before the beginning of the war. Therefore, all subsequent military actions were conducted by Japan in accordance with new plans which were developed after the beginning of the war. Inspired by success of the first months of war, the Japanese considered that they could act on the offensive in utterly different divisions simultaneously. And then the Japanese needed to seize Port Moresby, the major stronghold of the Allies, which was both the way to Australia and the last bulwark of the Allies in the region. The plans also included occupation of the Tulagi Island, aimed at establishing a float seaplane base there. Japan established several formations for the operation, so each of them could act promptly and independently of others. This tactic, as they believed, allowed them to fulfill several tasks simultaneously. The 5th Aircraft Carrier Division was assigned for the operation. It comprised Zuikaku and Shokaku aircraft carriers, which were to protect the landing force by the aircraft. The Battle of the Coral Sea became the first serious test for the Japanese aircraft carrier navy, as it was the case when Japanese aircraft carriers met American ones. And the Japanese undoubtedly called this battle their victory. They considered 2 aircraft carriers of the enemy to be probably destroyed. However, after the attack, the covering forces had 2 little planes left, so they had to postpone the landing on Port Moresby itself for an uncertain period of time. However, Tulagi Island was occupied, which strengthened the position of the Japanese on the Solomon Islands. The seizure of Port Moresby was considered an army operation, and the Navy was preparing another operation at the same time aimed at luring and destroying the rest of the American aircraft carriers. Now, after the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Americans were likely to have fewer aircraft carriers left, which made fulfillment of this task easier. Seizure of a military base on the Midway Atoll was to become a bait for the Americans. The Japanese reckoned that the enemy could not allow the loss of this strategic point and would surely answer the challenge, where there would be an armada of aircraft carriers and battleships waiting for the enemy. At the same time, the Navy was conducting an operation of landing on the Aleutian Islands, which were to become another pivot in the war against the Allies, which Japan was waging on many fronts simultaneously. In early June 1942, a huge Japanese fleet comprising over 70 ships and 4 aircraft carriers, Hiryu, Kaga, Soryu, Akagi, moved out towards the Midway Atoll. The Battle of Midway did not appear a complete defeat for the Americans, but it did destroy all the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, including Hiryu. During the battle, the Japanese repelled all the first attacks, but only the 2 last attacks turned out to be decisive for the battle. The Japanese tactics of conducting operations fell short, and now the Japanese had to reconsider it. However, Japan had successfully landed on the Aleutian Islands, and it was time now to fortify the positions on the occupied territories by turning them not only into fortresses, but also into big airfield junctions. Besides, after the battle, several American aircraft carriers were also damaged, so the Americans suffered great losses, which demonstrated to the Japanese that the enemy would not be able to act on the offensive actively for some time. An airfield under construction on the Guadalcanal island was to become one of the bases which would allow the Japanese to consolidate firmly their positions on the Solomon Islands. However, the Americans learnt of that construction and landed troops on the island. They seized the airfield without a blow and commenced proceeding with its building up. The Japanese could not conceive that the Americans could fortify their position there, so the army landing troops were supposed to throw them back to the sea without any problem. Unfortunately for the Japanese, they underestimated the enemy forces and failed to dislodge the enemy by their first attacks. The battles on Guadalcanal and around the island grew into a prolonged military campaign. The Marines landed on Guadalcanal on August the 8th. Japanese positions and the airfield were continuously attacked from the air from that moment. Both sides continued to send reinforcements to the island for months. As the scale of the battle continued to grow, it became obvious that the battle for Guadalcanal would forever turn the tide of the war. The campaign involved nearly all branches of the armed forces. Aircraft carriers and other warships exchanged blows. Warplanes from both sides engaged in hour-long dogfights. Infantry fought desperate battles in the disease-ridden jungle. Even a few tanks managed to traverse the virtually impenetrable terrain and join the fray. The Americans fought tooth and nail and eventually gained the upper hand, losing nearly 7,000 men in the campaign. Japanese losses numbered nearly 31,000. Two more carrier battles that took place during the Guadalcanal campaign further exacerbated the Japanese situation. More experienced Navy pilots were irreplaceably lost. A year after Pearl Harbor, less than half of the December 7th veterans were still alive. They were being replaced with novices straight out of flight school. In a single year, Japan experienced an incredible mix of triumph and failure. Carrier-based war, started by Japan, was lost no sooner than it had begun. Even before Pearl Harbor, the US government ordered 6 new Essex-class aircraft carriers. In contrast, the Japanese had only 1 new carrier in the works. They had nothing with which to replace their losses. However, by March 1st, 1943, Japan still occupied vast territories. The Japanese Army and Navy were working on new plans to reverse the course of the war in the Pacific. The war was not over yet.